In 5th edition D&D in particular, your selection of race also helps immerse yourself in the game world at the table. Hi, I'm John and welcome to D&D Cram School. In this video, we're going to be diving into what it means to select your character's race or lineage during character creation. In Dungeons & Dragons and similar role-playing games, a character's race really determines their culture and biology. For example, classically dwarves in Dungeons & Dragons tend to have a hardier constitution, meaning that they can take more punishment before going unconscious, whereas elves have a higher dexterity, meaning they tend to be a little bit more nimble and a little quicker. A lot of times, too, this would also impact how your DM would roleplay certain social encounters. So, for example, if your character was a dwarf and dwarves had a specific culture in the game world, that would affect how NPCs might interact with your character. Now, lineage, on the other hand, is kind of a newer term that's only popped up in more recent products for 5th edition. And from my understanding of it, lineage is really used when your character's racial traits are more based on individual circumstance rather than culture. So, for example, a dwarf that has the stone cutting trait might have that because they've been educated on a lot of different stonework. Whereas something like the Reborn from Von Richten's Guide to Ravenloft might have powers that have to do more with their circumstance rather than their upbringing. The other thing about lineage is that a lot of times the appearance of the character is more up to the player, even if its mechanics are the same as another character that shares that lineage. So, for example, a Dhampir might actually have an elven parent or a dwarven parent. And even though a dwarf and an elf Dhampir look differently and may be treated differently in the world, they still share the same mechanical traits as any Dhampir. Now, like I said, your race is going to also determine certain mechanics about your character. First is going to be your character's size category. Now, more for flavor, each race's entry has guidelines for things like height and weight, but the most mechanically significant of these is size category. And most player characters are small or medium. And this really doesn't amount to much. It really is the same amount of space on the board if you're playing with a grid, but it can affect certain things. Like I know small creatures have disadvantage if they're attacking with a heavy weapon. Examples of this from the player's handbook are that humans, dwarves, and elves are all considered medium creatures, whereas things like gnomes and halflings are considered small. So honestly, this might come into play when it comes to creating specific martial builds for a character, but otherwise this really doesn't come up too often at the table. What does come up at the table is your character's speed, and speed is the distance that they can travel within a round of combat. If you're playing with a grid, usually DMs will go with the measurement that each space is a 5 foot by 5 foot square. And if you want to think about it like a board game and you're figuring out how many spaces your character can move on the board, you just take their speed and divide it by 5. I find that most races have a standard speed of 30 feet or 6 spaces that they can move per round of combat, but there are exceptions to this. So halflings and dwarves have a smaller speed rating of 25, and wood elves have a speed of 35. If your DM is allowing certain races like Aarakocra, they even have fly speeds of 50. And while a lot of times this doesn't really come up, there are certain classes like rogue and monk where even a 5 foot difference in speed can mean the difference between being able to get within range of a faraway opponent or not. So it is something to consider while you're building your character. One of the more notable things that races or lineage give you are ability score increases. Now, traditionally, right up until recently actually, each race or lineage had set ability score increases, which would traditionally mean that there were certain options that would mesh better with certain classes. For example, if you wanted to play a cleric whose spellcasting is based on wisdom, if you were at all trying to optimize your character, you would want to look for a race selection that would also boost up the wisdom score, which would start to narrow your choices. In the player's handbook, really the only races that could help with wisdom were humans, because they could get to anything, hill dwarves, and wood elves. Now, with the recent release of Tasha's Cauldron of Everything, there is a variant rule that allows you to swap ability score increases around to whatever is going to mesh well with the character you had in mind. And in a lot of ways, this makes this part of the race entry fairly moot. Most races, including all the newest ones released by Wizards of the Coast, usually have one ability score can be increased by 2 and one ability score can be increased by 1. But there are exceptions to this rule. Notably would be the standard human option where that gets a +1 to everything. Mountain dwarves get a +2 and a +2 to play around with. And I think they did this with fairies and Harengon and Wild Beyond the Witchlight. But Tritons would also get 3 +1s instead of a +2 and a +1. Now, along with ability score increases, Tasha's also allows you to swap around bonus proficiencies you might get from your character's race. High elves in the player's handbook get an automatic proficiency in short bows, long bows, short swords, and long swords. And in a way, what that does is it demonstrates that high elf culture prefers those more finesse weapons to maybe the war hammers or axes of dwarven culture. And while that's great, it does also start to limit the number of optimized builds that you can make for your character. So for example, if you wanted a high elf Eldritch Knight, which is a fighter, right? Fighter already gives you a proficiency in all martial weapons. So rather than doubling up on those proficiencies and potentially wasting that part, now with Tasha's you can take those weapon proficiencies and get other kinds of proficiencies too. Honestly, I really like this because what it does is it gets you to really look at things like tool proficiencies or vehicle proficiencies, and you can have a much more rounded character that has some interesting skills that can create memorable moments at the table. Again, before moving on, I would like to remind everyone that these are technically optional rules, so you want to make sure to check in with your DM first before building your character like this. And while we're on the topic of consulting your DM, arguably one of the most important aspects about selecting your character's race or lineage is how they're going to fit into your Dungeon Master's game world. Oftentimes, a certain race's culture plays a big part in the story that's told at the table. I mean, look no further than Out of the Abyss. The entire module is written with Drow society in mind. So playing a Drow character in that game module is going to be very, very different than playing a surface dweller like a dwarf or a human. Now, we mentioned this in our introductory video, but it does bear repeating. How you portray a dwarven fighter is going to be different in, say, Faerun versus Eberron. In your DM's custom game world, maybe dwarves and elves have a history of warfare, and they see themselves as bitter rivals. Whereas in another game world, maybe dwarves and elves allied together to fight against another threat like giants or dragons. These little world building details can become very powerful tools to immerse yourself while you're portraying different characters. And maybe there's not even a dwarven or elven society. Maybe you're playing in the city of Sigil where there's a little bit of everyone and it's kind of a melting pot. In any case, the real big thing I'm trying to get across here is that your choice of race or lineage isn't purely a mechanical choice, but it's also a story building choice. That being said, you do want to understand the mechanical distinctions between the options that you have so that way you can mold the custom character that you want to play. So now I'm curious, do you guys have a favorite race or lineage selection in 5e? When you build your character, are you more interested in their story concept, their mechanics, or a little of both? Let us know in the comments down below. Next up for Cram School, we're going to be taking a look at your character's class. And until then, make sure to like and subscribe if you like this channel. And also stay tuned for more easy tips to start off your adventuring. Have an awesome day, everybody. Bye-bye now.